Beautiful televiewers and fervent listeners, these is Talking Point over your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. You're welcome on board. Today, in the course of this edition, we shall be discussing insecurity on the African continent with regards to the African Union's Agenda 2030 that is in line with silencing the guns on the African continent. Formally launched in 2017, Silencing the Guns in Africa is a flagship initiative of the African Union's Agenda 2063 that aspires to end all wars on the continent, conflict, gender-based violence, as well as genocide. The fourth aspiration of the African Union Agenda 2063 highlighted the establishment of a peaceful and a secure Africa characterized by conflict prevention measures that are centered on dialogue alongside conflict management and resolution with the end goal of silencing guns. During the 14th extraordinary session of the Assembly on Silencing the Guns held in December 2020 in Johannesburg, South Africa, the African Union extended the initiative until 2030, noting that certain gains were hampered by the COVID-19 pandemic and stressing the importance and interconnectedness of consolidating peace, preventing violent extremism, building social cohesion, as well as fostering democracy and enhancing economic development. However, there is a minimal visibility on member states' programs that ensure the effective implementation of efforts towards silencing the guns on national as well as regional scope. This has heightened calls for inclusive, collaborative and coordinated endeavors by both peaceful and conflict-prone states. Ladies and gentlemen, in the course of today's edition, like we mentioned, we shall be discussing these like our topic for today stipulates: what is the feasibility of silencing the guns by 2030? So, ladies and gentlemen, to evoke this topic of discussion pertaining to the African continent, we've been joined by Mr. OPEOLUWA TAIWO, who is the Executive Director of Africa Bridge Initiative based in Lagos. You're welcome on board, sir.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Hello, sir. Are you with us? If yes, please, can you kindly unmute your mic?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here today.
Thank you for honoring the invitation. So we're going to dive right into discussions on this very on topic that contains matters affecting the African continent, like we're discussing silencing the guns in Africa. Now, with the rise of insecurity across the African continent, now as an expert, do you think this goal is actually feasible by 2030?
For Africa as a continent, for Africa with more than 50 countries, we have the African Union. The silencing the gun by 2020 was a project by African Union as at May 2013, and it was supposed to be like for a decade, but apparently it was reviewed upward to 2030 as a result of the AU Agenda 2063. And what is the major target of this AU agenda? Talking about silencing internal wars, talking about silencing and reducing gender-based violence, talking about reducing genocide, talking about reducing internal conflicts within nations and within the continent of Africa. But beyond that, we can see that this particular agenda, by the leadership of African Union, that means by the leadership of each country of Africa, we can see that a lot of things, a lot of intricacies and technicalities has affected these projects. Number one, we talk about the climate change. Number two, we talk about the terrorism. Terrorism is a major bane in Africa as a country. And up to now, we're also having what we call the military coup. We can say about 4 nations pulling out of the AU, pulling out of the ECOWAS. That is as a result of the fact that African Union as a continent is no more united. It's just bearing that name. So it's no more united. And without unity, there's no way we can achieve the agenda of a silencing the gun by 2030. We can also look at the issue of bad governance, bad leadership. So these are major technicalities that is affecting and that will continue to affect the agenda. With what you have asked, 2030 is not visible. I must say that categorically. 2030 is not visible because having to fight climate change, having to fight terrorism, having to fight military coup, and it's not just fighting military coup. What is bringing military coup is simply bad words, bad leadership, economic instability, political instability. And another thing is what we call the sit-tight syndrome by the democratic elected leaders in Africa. And this is a major problem. This is a major catastrophe bedeviling the African continent. And the leadership of African continent must rise up. If truly we are very sure of 2030, the leadership must rise up that talking about the silencing the gun for 2030 is not just in paper. It's not just going to be in principle. The action must start, and the action must be intentional for us to achieve the 2030 agenda.
Exactly. We cannot achieve this goal without putting in place actions, so measurable goals that can be attained. And now, with regards to what you said, listening to our preamble, in line with that, could you assess, when you look at this agenda 2030, given what has been done up to now, because we're still at a point where Africa is still reeling from several conflicts in different countries across the continent. Now, could you assess so far what has been done by the African Union up to date to ensure that they assure or they attain these objectives of Agenda 2030?
In the process of accessing what our leaders have done in Africa, as of today, categorically speaking, I can tell you that the African leaders have not done up to 20% as expected of them. They've not done up to 20%. Because like I said, this agenda is not going to be on paper. This is an agenda to bring peace in Africa. This is an agenda to bring prosperity in Africa. This is an agenda to bring unity in Africa. And what are we talking about? Up to now, we are still fighting bad leadership. We are still fighting political instability. And don't forget, every agenda, every point, every policy needed by the African continent must be backed up by what we call political will. If we don't have the adequate political will, we are joking. And because of the political instability, that is why those four countries, Niger and other countries, having that capacity to pull out of ECOWAS. Do you know what that means? So a continent that is divided by itself cannot stand. So 4 countries pulling out of ECOWAS. That means ECOWAS is broken. And if ECOWAS is broken, invariably African Union is also broken. Because you cannot have African Union without having a strong and a vibrant ECOWAS. And who are the ECOWAS? Nigeria is in ECOWAS. Ghana is in ECOWAS. And don't forget, Nigeria is what? The giant of Africa, economically, politically, and even in terms of military apparatus. So if ECOWAS is pulling out, if more than 4 countries are pulling out of ECOWAS, both politically and economically, what does that mean? That means that there is a lot of problem within the ECOWAS as a sub-region in Africa. So if ECOWAS is having a problem, that means African Union, invariably we have more than enough problem. So the first solution is for the more than 50 countries to come together, and the leaders come together and agree on number 1, unity of purpose.
Exactly. It's
unity
all about,
of purpose.
Yeah, proceed, sir.
So when we have unity of purpose, then we cannot talk about the unity of economic stability. When we talk about unity of economic stability, we are talking about having single currency in Africa as a continent. We need to embrace Africa Free Continent Trade Agreement. That agreement must be properly itemized and properly followed as agreed upon by the political leaders in Africa. So when we have a free trade zone in Africa, that means we are looking for what? Single currency. That means we are saying that our borders should be open to each other. The borders of South Africa, the borders of Egypt should be open to Nigeria. That means for me sitting in Lagos, Nigeria, if I'm to go to Kenya for tourism, there should be no visa restriction. If I'm to go to South Africa for business, there should be no visa restriction. If I should be going to Cameroon, there should be no visa restriction. So what does that mean? That means that if I'm bringing goods and services from Nigeria into Cameroon, into Ghana, into Zambia, what does that mean? Those products will be very cheap because there is already mutual currency agreements. There is already mutual, export-import agreements, whereby there will be a lot of rebates for our local businesses. There will be a lot of rebates for our local and international farmers within Africa as a continent. But what is the first step? Unity of purpose by the African leaders. That is what is the #1 foundation. Because before we can talk about one currency, single currency for Africa as an economy.
Exactly, like you mentioned, a divided continent cannot stand. You have cited a lot of stuff, a lot of powerful points in your answer. But then, what accounts for this increase? Like we mentioned, if we have this problem of attacks on the African continent, it's all about, it's because the armed trade in Africa still continues to persist. But what accounts for the increase in armed trade across the continent, and how does this impact the rise in insecurity?
All right, so for Africa, like I highlighted earlier on, insecurity is a problem all over the world. It's not peculiar to Africa. We must understand that. There is insecurity in Afghanistan. There's insecurity in Gaza. There's insecurity in America. There is insecurity in Russia. There is insecurity in Ukraine. Look at recently, Ukraine is fighting war. And Ukraine is supplying grain to Nigeria, to Africa. Is that not a shame to African leaders? That is a shame to us. A country that is in war is still supplying us agricultural grains. So what does that mean? That means that insecurity is not peculiar to us. We must live above insecurity. We must be united. The unity of purpose, the unity of economic activities is the foundation of our solution. When we have unity in our economic activities, I promise you, insecurity challenge will go down by 60%. But when the security apparatus in Nigeria is not in unity with the security apparatus in Cameroon, the terrorist group will find a way to exploit their way within the division. Because the terrorism group can see clearly that there is a lot of division between African leaders. So can we close that gap? Can we close that division within African leaders? When we close that gap, I promise you, insecurity will be reduced drastically in the African region. I promise you that. So let's have that, closing the gap, bridging that gap between African leaders, between African countries. Let's have a unity of purpose, unity of economic activities in South Africa, in Gabon, in Egypt, in South Sudan. Let's have that unity. When there is unity in our economic activities, whatever is happening to the Nigerian army will be happening to the army of Niger. Whatever is happening to the Nigerian army will be happening to Cameroonian army or armed forces. What does that mean? Whoever is coming into Nigeria from Cameroon, he or she will have been properly screened with proper identity from Cameroonian. So by the time he or she gets to Nigeria, through the effort of what? technological innovation. The software is available. Nigerian army can use their technology to decode, is this man a true Cameroonian or not? So we can see that moving from unity of economic activities, we also need what I call technology innovation for us to bridge the gap and have a robust silencing the gun by 2030, which is very much achievable by the leadership of Africa.
And exactly that drives me to the next question. I was about evoking this, the role of technology in addressing this phenomenon that's plaguing the continent. Now, how can the African Union, or say how can the continent as one big family, use this innovation, the spread of technology in a bit to counter this increase or rise in insecurity, thereby silencing the guns by this given a time frame, which is 2030?
For Africa as a continent, do you know that as of today, the GDP of entire Africa is not equivalent to the balance sheet of 4 multinational companies in the United States of America? The GDP of the entire Africa as a continent is not up to the balance sheet of 4 multinational companies in the United States of America. What does that show to us? Our economy is still under shadow. We need to open up our economy. And for us to open up our economy in the 21st century, we need the technology innovation. We need to invest more in technology advancements. We need to invest more in artificial intelligence. We need to invest more in affordable and sustainable internet access. Average youth in Africa does not have access to the internet because it is very expensive. As at 2023, I was part of the 50 young leaders in Africa that joined other leaders from Japan and Canada. And we organized what we call 1 Million Leadership Africa, OMLA. It was a fellowship program. And during my fellowship program with my counterpart from Cameroon and other countries, I was told that in Cameroon, internet, data is very expensive. So anytime I want to communicate with my counterpart in Tanzania, in Egypt, in South Africa, it is very tedious. It's not seamless. So we can see that having access to the internet in Africa up to now is still very expensive. It's not affordable. Our leaders, our economic and political leaders must invest more in data protection, in data engagement. In 21st century, no technology, no development. No technology, no innovation, no development. So our leaders must come together and break that genes of what? Of cabal within our technology space. If our leaders can break into the technology space globally and putting data in the hand of an average youth in Africa, I can tell you that in the next 5 years, the exponential growth in Africa will be more than that of China in the next 10 years. I promise you that. But that cannot be possible until we open up our technological space and our what? Our data management space for us to have what? Data, internet access to an average youth in Africa. With that, part of sustainment in the next 10 years.
Exactly, like you said, no innovation, no development. Now, we saw in 2018 it was supposed to happen, but never did. The African passport was supposed to come into realization, but that never existed. We equally saw the dream of having a borderless Africa, though some countries on the African continent in recent times are striving to actually make that a reality. We're seeing it with Kenya, with Burundi, with Rwanda, and a host of others. And now with that in mind, do you see Africa staying on track with realizing this target of silencing the guns by 2030?
In the process of silencing the gun as of 2030, as of today, we are not on the right track. We must tell ourselves the truth. You cannot be on the right track when the military are taking over power. You can't be on the right track. Because when the military are taking over, you are bringing gun back. When there is military intervention, when there is a military coup, there will be genocide. There will be gender-based violence. There will be war. So we are saying, if we are to walk by the
Mr. OPEOLUWA, are you with us?
no more military intervention in Africa. No more military intervention in Africa. Military intervention will bring gender-based violence. Military intervention in Africa will bring war. Military intervention in Africa will bring genocide. Military intervention in Africa will bring conflict. And we don't want conflict. We don't want genocide. Because anyway, you see the military, there will be abuse of power. There will be abuse of resources. So as of today, the Africa leaders are not on the right track. For us to be on the right track, every part of Africa must be on democracy. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. We are saying no to military intervention.
Exactly. It's all about Africa for its people. Now, do you think that these conflicts, the numerous conflicts we've seen on the African continent, can actually hamper inclusive growth in Africa? Because we're looking at a continent that will be able to harness its potential and definitely develop, say, by the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. But with all the numerous conflicts still happening on the African continent, will these affect this dream of having inclusive growth? Mr. OPEOLUWA, are you with us? We might be facing some connection disturbances. Just a note that, ladies and gentlemen, if you just joined us, this is Talking Point over for you, Media Africa, where today we're discussing the African Union's Agenda 2030, silencing the guns on the African continent. Let's note that in December, on December 6, 2020, the African Union actually extended its initiative, of silencing the guns in Africa in the bid to ensure a secure continent. So that is what we are discussing in the course of today's edition with our guest, Mr. OPEOLUWA TAIWO, who is the Executive Director of the Africa Bridge Initiative based in Lagos. So we just got indications. Mr. TAIWO, are you back with us? Okay, we just got information that he has left as a result of, say, bad network. Like they say,
yes.
Man makes internet
All
and
right.
internet is bound to fail. Technology, okay, we'll blame that on technology. You're welcome back, sir.
Yes, yes.
Okay, like I was asking before, technology actually shifted you away from me. How can conflict on the African continent hamper inclusive growth in Africa?
In Africa, we've been having series of conflicts. Internal conflict, inter-conflict, and intra-conflict. There are conflicts within Africa as a continent, and there are conflicts within nations of Africa. For instance, in Nigeria, there are conflicts between the north, there are conflicts between the south, there are conflicts between the east. So you can see even the three major regions within Nigeria are not fully united. So you can see that there are intra-conflicts. So, and these conflicts is as a result of various intervention of both visible and invisible hands, the non-state actors, the non-regulated, non-state actors. You know, for every state, there are state actors and non-state actors. Now, most times, the non-state actors, some of them are working against the states. And when you are working against the states, so that means there will be conflicts. That means the state actors and the non-state actors working against each other. That's conflict. So we are having intra-conflict and inter-conflict within the nations and the continent of Africa. And that is why I've said it earlier on. Our agenda from AU for 2030 on silencing the gun, as of today, is not realistic. We might need to extend the date because this, as of today, this is 2024. We have just 6 years to go. What can we do within 6 years? What can be achieved within 6 years? Don't forget, even if you are silencing the conflict, if you are silencing terrorism within the Africa, within the next 5 years, what about the economic impact?
Back to you, Mr. OPEOLUWA. Are you with us?
For you to have stability, for you to have political stability, that means that you are having a seamless transition from one democratic elected government.
So unfortunately, we lost you once again, hoping that you join us. So we're discussing how say conflicts on the African continent will actually impact the inclusive growth of the African Union, say growth on the African continent. Now, according to a fervent follower of a talking point, he states that he is a Pan-Africanist, Mr. America Emmanuel Nudini. He says that the only way the only thing that can silence guns in the African continent is self-governance. It goes further to say the local legislators, that is elected representatives of the people, being allowed to solve their own local problems with local solutions. Now, Mr. OPEOLUWA, do you agree with this listener or say this follower of talking point?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good assertion from our viewer. That's a good assertion. We must understand that the legislators and the executive of every country must come together with the judiciary to bring internal democracy. When there is no internal democracy in Niger, in Cameroon, in Nigeria, then there cannot be democracy in Africa. That's what the man is trying to tell us. We must have internal democracy. We must have strong political institutions in every country of Africa. Strong democratic institutions, strong judiciary, strong and independent judiciary, strong legislative arm of government. Because the job of the legislators is to make law. So if they are not independent, that means their law will not be achievable. If they are to make law and the executive are subjugating their power, that means they will be making law being presented by the executive, not the law being presented by the citizen. So we can see that the nations of Africa must be developed, and that is why I usually say Africans will develop Africans. Europe cannot develop Africa. America cannot develop Africa. Even America is relying on Africa for the next 2 decades for economic stability. They are relying on our agricultural facilities. They are relying on our solid mineral resources. They are relying on us. They are relying on our natural resources. So Africa will only be developed by Africans. America cannot develop Africa. So African leaders must rise up that this is the time to be united. Absolutely. This is the time to be united economically, politically, for us to have a robust and a peaceful nation in the next 1 decade.
Exactly. Africa can only become what it wants, and it can only be done by Africans. And now, Mr. America Emmanuel, he says he is a Pan-Africanist and the author of the book, The United States of African Federations, How to Unite and Govern a United Africa. And now he goes further to say Africa should focus on building good governance systems rather than looking for leaders who sometimes do not leave the problems faced by those that they are called to govern. Now, what's your input with regards to what this viewer had to say? Because it comes at a point where sometimes the leaders put in place don't sometimes feel the pain that the oppressed or those affected by, say, conflicts are going through. Now, how does this apply to this contemporary society?
All right, that's a good one from the viewer. So what is trying to tell us that the oppressor, that is talking about the citizen, the oppressed must be liberated from the oppressor. The citizens are the oppressed. The government leaders, the political gladiators, they are the oppressor. So we, the citizens, must liberate ourselves from the oppressors for us to have a robust economy in the 21st century in every nation of Africa. That is what he's trying to say, that we must not rely on our political leaders, because our political leader, the totality of their ideology is sit-tight syndrome. They don't want to relinquish power. So we must let them understand that we are ready for good governance. We are ready for democracy, true African democracy. We are ready for Pan-African democracy. That is, government of Africa, by Africa, and for Africans. So every citizen of Africa must rise up to the challenge at hand. We must rise up in Cameroon. We must rise up in Gambia. We must rise up in Zambia. That enough is enough. No more oppression by the political gladiators. No more oppression by our political leaders. We must understand, we must show them that this is the way to run governments. Not oppression, not subjugation, not neocolonialism. We want a true democracy. We want a true Africa that will be governed by Africans. We don't want imported economy. We want economy that will thrive based on agriculture, economy that will thrive based on natural resources, economy that will thrive based on our individual ingenuity as a country, as a continent. Like China was developed. China was developed by Chinese, not American developing Chinese. So Nigeria must develop Nigerians. Africa must develop Africans. And like we read in the school by Walter Rodney, how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Europe, America, and other nations will always find a way to get our resources and make us to be subjugated to their economic intricacies and technicalities. But we must liberate ourselves as a result of our economic investment into agriculture, economic investment into technology innovation, economic investment into artificial intelligence. That is the new way to govern ourselves in Africa. And when we do that, the economy of Africa will be open to the entire world, and Nigeria and Africa will be the new bride of the world in the 21st century economy.
Very powerful. And just to reiterate that you are the executive director of the Africa Bridge Initiative based in Lagos, Nigeria. Now, getting your contribution in regards to today's topic of discussion, what do you think is how could you interrelate good governance with this African Union's agenda of silencing the guns on the continent?
Yes, good governance in Africa cannot be overemphasized. You cannot be looking for peace and you are fighting war.
Exactly.
So our leaders within their country, they are fighting war. They are instigating war. Yes, they are looking for peace. That is deception. Our leaders are deceiving us. That is deception. You can't be talking about peace in 2030. And as of today, you are creating war. You are instigating different continents. You are instigating different regions of your country. You're instigating the North against the South. You're instigating the East against the West. How do we have peace? When there's no peace in Nigeria, there can never be peace in Africa. When there's no peace in Gabon, there can never be peace in Africa. When there's no peace in Cameroon, how do we have peace in Africa? That is not sustainable. What we are saying is that good governance, economic stability, those are the roadway, the pathway to achieving our agenda for the African Union. And African Union must understand that you are sitting on a gunpowder if the care is not taken. Military will end up taking over more countries if the needful is not done as soon as possible, because the citizens are crying, the citizens are suffering as a result of what? Maladministration, as a result of what? Economic mismanagement, as a result of what? High rate of inflation. So the leadership of African Union must find a way to economic stability, must find a way to having affordable and consistent food supply for the citizen of Africa. Don't forget, an hungry man is an angry man. An angry man is a danger to his nation. It's a danger to the continent of Africa.
Thank you immensely, Mr. OPEOLUWA. Now, you've cited a lot of key and powerful points. You said unity could be used to reduce the level of insecurity in the African continent, thereby silencing the guns in Africa. Now, with all the aforementioned steps and suggestions which you have put forth, now do you see this Agenda 2030 being fulfilled?
The African Union Agenda for 2030, talking about silencing the gun, is achievable. It is practicable. It's a very smart goal. But it might not be achievable by that date. It is achievable, but that date, as of today, is not realistic. We're having just what? 6 years. Just 6 years to what? Just 6 years to the end of what? 2030. 6 years. So 6 years is not enough. The vision is achievable. The vision is realistic. The vision is needed by the continent of Africa. But we need to expand the dates. But before we expand the dates, we must be ready to put ourselves together in terms of our military apparatus, in terms of economic stability, in terms of technology innovation, in terms of what? Sustainable agricultural sector. When the agricultural sector is sustainable, the health sector will be sustainable. When the agricultural sector is sustainable, the educational sector will be sustainable. Education is the bedrock of any development in any world. As of today, an average child does not have access to free basic education. That alone is a danger to Agenda 2063. So, African Union leaders must come together. Let's have free basic education. Let's have quality and sustainable food supply. Let's have sustainable educational system in the next 10 years. With all these factors put in place and having a robust international, intercontinental economic relationship, it is possible for us to achieve the silencing the gun by 2030.
Exactly, like you said, it is realistic and it is achievable in spite of the numerous plagues on the African continent. This goal is something that the African continents can actually dream of. And now, with the various points you've mentioned, you said it's achievable, but there are still a lot of points that needs to be looked at. Now, could you highlight some of the lapses of this agenda and what could be done for the the continent, especially a global or regional body like the African Union, to be able to march towards it?
For African Union, follow the African Continent Free Trade Zone. Follow the agreements. One passport in Africa. No more visa in the Africa as a continent. Let's have a free trade zone between each countries of Africa. One currency, single currency in Africa. Single currency in Africa, one passport for Africa as a continent. Robust and accessible technological innovation in Africa. Increase the investment in our military apparatus. Secure the individual national borders. Have what we call sustainable and consistent democratic transition for every government in Africa. If all of these factors are put together, African Union will smile come 2030. That is our request as a citizen of Africa.
Exactly. It's all about a collective effort for the development of the African continent. Now we're gradually coming to the end of today's edition of Talking Points over your #1 Pan-African channel. I'd like to ask you, sir, now could you give your closing remarks to today's topic of discussion, just to reiterate, ladies and gentlemen, you're watching us on 4U Television, listening to us on 4U Radio, the Pan-African Radio, from 96.3, meanwhile we're streaming on our respective social media platforms. Now, meanwhile, before we close up, could you give us a closing remark with regards to how the African Union and the African continent can actually work towards achieving this agenda of silencing the guns come 2030?
For today, for the African Union leaders, come together on a round table. For African Union leaders, have a unity of purpose, have a sincerity of purpose. For African Union leaders, have a stakeholder engagement. For African Union leaders, you must put together data management security for the entire continent. For African Union leaders, you must understand that no one can build the continent of Africa. Only the Africans understand the problems of Africa. Only the Africans understand the agricultural integrity of Africa. Only the African leaders can build and increase food supply in the entire Africa. Only the African leaders can give us a robust and a sustainable democratic leadership in Africa. When all of these are put together, our security challenge will reduce drastically. And once our security challenge reduces drastically, by 2030, our goal will be achievable. And the entire continent of Africa will be smiling as a robust economy in the 21st century and as a giant of 21st century business economy in the Community of Nations of the world.
Thank you immensely, Mr. OPEOLUWA TAIWO, for that brilliant contribution. Like you said, unity is strength. Thank you for your participation on today's edition of Talking Points.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I love Africa. I love Nigeria. God bless Africa. God bless Nigeria.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the Executive Director of Africa Bridge Initiative, joining us all the way from Lagos in Nigeria. It's on that note that we will be drawing down the curtains of today's edition of Talking Points over your #1 Pan-African channel. Meanwhile, we're discussing the African Union's initiative of silencing the guns by the year 2030. We believe you learned a lot from today's discussion. Like he mentioned, unity is strength on the African continent, and a divided continent cannot stand. I have been your humble host, NJIX and NABESEH, for presentation. Meanwhile, we say thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and do stay in company of our programs.